Welcome to Everything is Everything. I'm Amit, and this is my good friend Ajay, who has promised us today edge of the seat excitement. And that's what happened to the country a few days ago, a few mornings ago. This glorious moment happened when one opened the Business Standard. When I say one opened, I didn't open because I don't subscribe to any paper. One opened the Business Standard and found this brilliant column written by Vijay Kelkar, Arvind Modi, and Ajay Shah about the GST and how it could be made much better, that there is tremendous room for improvement, and immediately policy makers across the country squealed in delight, unless they were part of government, where they squealed in embarrassment because all their follies were revealed to the world. So today's episode is not just about this brilliant piece by Ajay, which is incredibly insightful and which talks about the various ways in which the GST can still be improved, but it's also about GST itself. Because what many of you may not know is that in the early 2000s, a seminal paper came out authored by three gentlemen, and the three gentlemen I just named, who were the people, and the paper was in GST. So that's when the concept first took fruition within India and started making its way through policy circles. It took many, many years, more than a decade, for it to actually take shape. They didn't like the shape it took. They don't like the shape it is in now. But I thought it's important to kind of talk about, the origin story behind India's GST, why it was necessary, what could have been done differently, and how it can still be improved. And this is really important because a lot of the popular discourse I see around GST, doesn't look at the larger context of it. And I think that larger context is super important.
We should always start at economic growth. Our job in all questions around the state is to create conditions for economic growth. How is that done? We know it's very easy. You just have to get high productivity firms. Okay, you just have to get Nvidia and Google to emerge out of the Indian soil, and then you're done. How do you get there? In 10 different glorious, I'm making it up, in 15 different glorious EIA episodes, we've told the story about high productivity firms. How do you create conditions for the emergence of high productivity firms? And there are basically three key ingredients for a country to become a host to high productivity firms. The first is specialization. This is Adam Smith's pin idea that if you're a jack of all trades, you're a master of none. A firm needs to focus and do a few things and do them really well. So specialization is very important. The second principle is learning by doing. Experience curves. Wright's law, which we covered in an episode about Moore's laws. Gentle reader, if you think you're a business person or an economics person and Moore's law is not interesting to you, I promise you that episode on Moore's law is central to understanding economic growth in India, and you need it. And please be sure to get that episode. So that's the second one. It is cost experience curves. You specialize, then you do the damn thing over and over. In the phraseology of the great Amit Varma, you put in volume. Okay, if you've made 10,000 pins, you ain't seen nothing yet. When you get to 100,000 pins, you'll be better at doing it, and so on. So specialize, hang in there, get economies of scale, and then ride Wright's law, which are cost experience curves. Your lifetime production of pins determines your cost efficiency in making pins. And the third piece is globalization. Remove all barriers at the border. Okay, so if capital, labor, goods, services, enterprise will move freely across the border, we will better create conditions for Indian excellence. It's in our self-interest as India to create conditions for Indian excellence by removing the thicket that is there at the border, remove barriers to movement of labor, remove barriers to movement of capital, remove barriers to movement of goods, remove barriers to movement of services, remove barriers to enterprise, i.e. Indian firms operating abroad, foreign firms operating in India. Okay? This is the grand theory of economic growth. We do all this, we create conditions for Indian genius to make high productivity firms. We make high productivity firms, we get GDP growth. Okay, that's it. That's all there is. There is nothing else to the journey to getting economic growth. It's very easy, You should try it one of these days.
And we've done an episode I will point to on development economics where we spoke about Land Pritchett's work. And, because new viewers of the show might wonder why we're talking economic growth, economic growth, economic growth. It is because by now we've looked at history and it's conclusively shown that every human welfare indicator from good health to etc., you name it, all depends on per capita GDP rising. Economic growth is a whole story. And, you want to get a country out of poverty, which is India's moral imperative. The only way to do so is economic growth.
Now you turn to the state. So, what is the role of the state in all this? Peace, easy taxes, a tolerable administration of justice, and get some basics done, and that will require some money. So, the state will need to raise some money through taxes. It doesn't need to be a whole lot. I'm not a supporter of big state projects. Many economists believe that more tax revenues by the government is in general a good thing. I happen to think upside down, where the Indian state is right now. It would generally be better if the Indian state would spend less, would tax less, get less revenue. Okay, in about 10% of GDP, you can become the UK of 1910. You can be an empire that rules the whole world. You can be a country with a higher per capita GDP than where we are in India today, all in 10% of GDP. So you don't need a whole lot of money. The size of the Indian state is way overdone. So we need some money. For that money, we'll need some taxation. Okay, how should that taxation be done? This is where I want to put up the overriding consideration. The job of the tax system is to not interfere with the three sources I described above. I said specialization, rights law, cost experience curves, and globalization. These are the three engines of firm productivity. So the job of the tax system is never ever mess with these three. Do not come in the way. Do not tax the country in a way that will in any way, shape or form interfere with specialization, interfere with rights law, interfere with globalization. That is the concept and the principle of a good tax system. And while I'm on this subject in chapter 1, I also want to say something very clearly, that if you are a decision maker for policy making in India, and suppose I give you two choices. Case 1, the Indian state has total tax revenues of 15 rupees on a GDP of 100. Case 2, the Indian state has tax revenues of 15 and a GDP of 200. Which will you prefer? Okay, too many people in Indian taxation will think it's okay, 15, what's the difference? That is wrong. GDP counts. If you get to a higher GDP for the same tax revenue, that's a huge win. Okay, the people don't want you to have tax revenues. The people want GDP. Okay, this is something that is just like profoundly lost in the thread of Indian tax policy. People always think in terms of the tax GDP ratio. So 15 upon 100, 15 upon 200. 15 upon 200 is a lower tax GDP ratio than 15 on 100. So the instinctive response of a lot of economists, tax policy experts, etc., will be to say 15 and 200 is a less good outcome. And I just want to say no. Tax policy doesn't exist to serve the state. Tax policy exists to serve the people, i.e., to be compatible with a higher GDP. And this is something we must always keep in mind, that a good country is one with a higher GDP. And if, by the way, it involves your having a lower tax GDP ratio, that's perfectly okay. So we shouldn't put the state first. We should put the people first. A good tax policy system is one that creates conditions that is amenable to the emergence of high productivity firms and thus high GDP. So that is how we will view the questions of indirect taxation, and that's what will take us to GST. In the field of public finance, we have a coy word which is called bad taxes. Okay, so there are good taxes and there are bad taxes. This sounds very mild to others. Okay, I just want to say amongst us economists, bad taxes are mind-blowingly stupid things that only an idiot would ever do. Okay, it is not mild. It is like, my God, you have left money on the table. You have harmed the country by running those taxes. So bad taxes are really, really, really bad ideas. Nobody should ever do a bad tax.
I feel like starting a hashtag, not all taxes.
Yeah. And this is something that, when we are inside my baradari, we know this crystal clear. We know good taxes and bad taxes. And bad taxes are just like dumb, like don't do them. You'll really make things worse. But in the larger community, people don't appreciate the extent of clarity behind the words good taxes and bad taxes. There's just a handful of things that are good taxes, and every other scheme known to man is a bad tax. And that's not that the government doesn't need tax money. It is that you are self-harming by having that design of the tax. You're making the world better. Okay, let me come to one example of a bad tax. A bad tax is a cascading tax, okay, where there are many stages of production and you're hitting every stage of production with a tax. And so you end up with taxation of taxation, and that works really badly. Let me walk through one example slowly so you'll get a flavor of how a 10% tax, it appears like a mild number, 10%. It doesn't sound like a big number. And we're going to apply it at stages of production, and you'll see how it turns into a monster. It escalates and it turns into a monster. Okay, so step one, a farmer sells cotton to a spinner for 100 rupees. The tax rate is 10%. So the invoice shows 110. Okay, 110. The spinner pays 110. 10 rupees goes to the government. Now the spinner makes yarn and sells it to a weaver for 200. I'm just making up a value addition that 110 became 200 and 10% tax. So in the invoice made by the spinner, it's 200, 10% is 20, it's 220. So the invoice value is 220 and another 20 rupees goes to the government. So he already got 10 rupees earlier and now he's got another 20 rupees that goes to the government. Now that cloth, the fabric, is sold to a tailor for 300 rupees. That invoice shows 330. Again, a nice mild 10% tax. But now a new 30 rupees has gone to the government and the overall price has become 330. Finally, the tailor sells a shirt to the customer for 400 rupees. Now again, 400 and 10% is 40 rupees. Now another 40 rupees has gone to the government.
So that's a total of 100 rupees that have gone to the government.
Correct. On what is apparently a 400 rupee shirt. And as an end customer, you may even feel mild. Okay, 400 rupee shirt. I paid a 10% sales tax. It's not so bad. And I paid 440. It doesn't seem that offensive. But once you see this whole thing, you can't unsee it. That what the hell? On a 400 rupee shirt, the government got 100 rupees of tax. That's 25%. That's not on. Like, that is absolutely not correct. That's a completely different environment of taxation. It's a much higher effective tax burden. So this is what cascading taxes do. Now, let us analyze cascading taxes from the viewpoint of the first principle, Adam Smith's pin example, specialization. What is the incentive in the system for individual firms when they see these cascading taxes? The firm will think, why should I specialize? Okay, a person will try to make one factory, they'll try to make one company which goes all the way from petrochemicals to cloth. Okay, and I have a suggested brand name for that cloth. It's called Vimal. Okay, and that vertical integration is a reflection of that tax regime. That it made sense to go all the way from petrochemicals to fabric and not specialize, because that old Indian tax system penalized every stage of production. Now you created value out of thin air by creating a vertically integrated monolith. But you know what? That violates the fundamental pathway of economic growth, which is specialization. So this is the way in which this crude tax policy decision, at every producer, wherever somebody sells to somebody, will charge 10%. So this is called an excise. It's a tax on production. Whenever anybody produces, firm 1 sells to firm 2. The tax man is standing at the gate saying, I'll charge you 10%. If you wish, make it 5%. It sounds very mild. 5% excise sounds very small. It's a profound error because of the incentives that it generates. It is a bias against specialization. It gives firms the wrong idea about what to do. Okay, so this is an example where a tax on production is a bad tax. A tax on production is a cascading tax, is a tax on a tax on a tax. It leads to very large true incidence of taxation. While sounding mild, it sounds like a nice meek 5% tax, but it's actually something truly terrible. This is an example of how a bad tax yields a very bad outcome, and this is not a small matter. You're striking at one of the 3 pillars of economic growth. There are only 3 pillars of economic growth. One of them is specialization. When you make this mistake, we are damaging the specialization of the country, and this is not on. Every God-fearing economist should stand up and put up dharna saying this is a bad tax.
Our economists don't fear God, they fear government. Government fearing economists should be the new term.
Yeah.
Tragic.
Now let me turn to international trade. First, if you do this cascading taxes of tax on tax on tax, okay, at the end, the buyer of the shirt pays 440 rupees, and truly it's a 25% tax on the shirt. Now, how is the Indian shirt producer going to compete with a country with brilliant Bengali economists who have constructed a superior tax system? It's called Bangladesh. Okay, because Bangladesh has only Bengali economists. They got it right. Okay, and so in Bangladesh they get tax policy right. They don't do cascading taxes. So the overall aggregate taxation on a shirt in Bangladesh is not 25%. They don't have cascading taxes. Now that's not going to be nice for Indian firms to compete. So this will hinder globalization. It will damage the ability of Indian firms to play in global markets. This damages pillar 3 of high economic growth. If you don't support globalization, and here I'm not saying support as in subsidy, I'm just saying be compatible with specialization, be neutral to specialization, be compatible with globalization, be neutral to globalization. Such cascading taxes drive up the price of domestically produced goods and damage their global competitiveness, because you're going to see in 5 minutes that the world actually does this in a different and brilliant way, in a zero tax way, in a brilliant way where there are no indirect taxes on any goods in international trade. So if you put taxes on Indian goods, you're really harming the ability of Indian goods to participate in international trade. Finally, think about imports. So the world has these brilliant, clean ideas where foreign goods are not 100 rupees tax on a 400 rupee shirt. So the foreign shirt comes in at 300. Now the Indian guy cries foul saying, I'm at 440, but the foreigner is at 300. And then they'll say, give me tariffs. And that is another nightmare. So in a way, we are creating conditions for the political economy where the Indian firms will say, look, I really can't. There's no way I can get the shirt down to 300 because the world is getting it done at 300 because they don't have these kinds of mistakes. Okay, so I've showed you that what sounds like a low tax rate with the wrong tax system design, which involves cascading taxes, which involves taxation of production, is truly damaging. It stabs economic growth. It harms specialization. It harms globalization. It holds India back. No country should do this kind of thing, and we need a way out.
And from the primitive point of view of the economist who thinks that 15% out of 100 rupees GDP is actually preferable, from the primitive point of view, he's actually getting a greater percentage of taxes here because he is getting that 100 out of 100 rupees out of 400. Then he is further putting a tariff on goods, and whoever chooses to pay the tariff is getting that also. So the state is happy in its primitive thinking that, oh, I'm getting a greater tax to GDP ratio. Doesn't matter if GDP is kept small. I get more. And actually, they are wrong even there because the GDP would have been far higher and the absolute number in taxes would also have been far higher if the economy was just allowed to
And
grow.
in this, I want to call out the development economists. The development economists have always blithely gone along with an idea that a higher tax GDP ratio is always a good thing. And I just want to say, no, excuse me, no, there is a wrong way to think about it. First comes GDP. The per capita GDP of the people is paramount. Then we'll think about what is the tax GDP ratio that you can get. And second, no, the Indian state does not do a great job of spending. If you gave the Indian state half the money that it has today, we'd probably be better off.
So, Ajay, we do this. But strangely, there are good Bengali economists somewhere, namely Bangladesh, and they don't do this. And the rest of the world doesn't do this. And they've sorted this. So, what's the way out?
One of the great advances of 20th century economics was the invention of the VAT, the value added tax. Okay, so there was a French economist called Maurice Laure, I don't know how to pronounce it. In 1954, he invented the value added tax. Okay, gentle reader, if you ever dare call economics a dismal science, or you think economics is the boring game of sitting in an office and writing R programs and learning some theorem proofs, okay, please disabuse yourself of all these notions. Economics is about these glorious fundamental things, that it is an economist who understood all this deeply and invented a solution to all these problems. Okay, this is the VAT, the value added tax. There's going to be a little bit of a confusing terminology as we go along in this show. So right now I just want to focus the mind. I'm giving you the pure conceptual theoretical definition of the word VAT. There used to be a tax in India called central VAT, the Sen VAT. While it was called a VAT, it was actually not a VAT. So don't think that I'm describing the old Indian Sen VAT. I'm describing the economist's ideal of the VAT. What's the idea? At each stage of production, on each invoice, we will have a tax, but it will be a tax not on the production, but on the value added. Okay, so I buy some raw materials, I add some value. So I buy raw materials for 100, I sell some goods for 200, and my value addition is 100. There'll be a tax on the value addition, not on the production. Okay, and this simple idea is transformative because it becomes neutral to the complexity of the production process. Whether you do vertical integration or you make it in many pieces, it's all neutral. Let's go through that same example once again. Okay, so step one, the farmer sells cotton for 100 rupees. On that, we're going to have a 10% VAT. All 100 is value addition because the farmer started from cotton seeds. We're going to ignore that. He had saved up seeds from last year. Okay, and the farmer started from nothing, out of thin air. With love and fresh air, the farmer got to 100 rupees of cotton, and on that invoice there's 10 rupees of the VAT. He sends 10 rupees to the government. Okay, you're the buyer. On your invoice it shows 100 rupees of cotton, 10 rupees of VAT, 110. You paid 110. Out of that, 10 went to the government. Now at step 2, the spinner sells yarn for 200. Okay, and it apparently shows as an invoice of 200, and 10% of that is 20. Okay, but the spinner has already paid 10% VAT, 10 rupees VAT at the first stage of production. So when the spinner has to send 20 rupees to the government, the spinner says, here's my invoice that proves that already 10 rupees has come to you, and now I will only pay a 10 additional to you. So it is not a cascading tax, that all the tax that was incurred at the earlier stages of production is an input tax credit at the next stage of production. Okay, so bottom line, the second invoice looks like 220 to 20, but the new tax money that comes to the government is only 10 because there's input tax credit of the previous stage. And so we go to the third stage. The weaver sells fabric for 300 plus 30 on the invoice, but the weaver has input tax credit of 20. So the input tax credit has traveled all the way to the weaver. 10 rupees from that farmer cotton stage, 10 rupees from the spinner stage. Now I kinda owe 30 to the government, but I have input tax credit of 20. So now only 10 rupees goes to the government. Finally, the tailor sells the shirt for 400. It apparently shows a 40 rupees tax, but there's input tax credit of 30. So the tailor only remits 10. So overall, when a shirt is 400, the taxation of the shirt is only 40, that is 10%. Okay, this is the genius of the VAT. The key insight is, it doesn't matter what stages of production you have. You can be more specialized, you can be less specialized, but the taxation will be neutral to that. So the tax system is saying, firms, you are on your journey to glory and productivity through specialization. We will not create perverse incentives for you to despecialize, for you to become a petrochemicals to fabrics company where everything is vertically integrated. You choose. If you think that maybe a spinning factory and a weaving factory makes sense to have side by side, you choose. The government has no view on whether more specialization, less specialization. But depending on the firm's decisions about the choice of the most effective mechanism for production, the government's tax system is neutral. Nice. So this is one brilliant thing about the VAT. In this, I want to draw attention to the travel of input tax credit. Okay. So remember, at the fourth stage, we had a shirt for 400 rupees and a parent tax of 40 rupees. But 10 rupees came all the way from the cotton stage, 10 rupees from the spinning stage, 10 rupees from the cloth stage. The travel of input tax credit is the engine, is the heart of the VAT. If you don't have the movement of input tax credit going correctly, then it's not a VAT, then it's just a production tax with all those deleterious outcomes. And that is pompous English, with all those bad tax outcomes. And now I want to talk about globalization. This design turns out to be 100% compatible with globalization through one trick. Okay, the trick is called zero rating of exports. So what does that mean? Case one, you make shirts, you sell them to me, we're both in India, fine, 400 rupees, 40 rupees, I write a check. I make a UPI payment of 440 rupees to you. Okay, that's because both of us are in India. Now, if a foreigner comes along and buys that same shirt, then zero rating of the VAT means that there will be no tax applied to the foreigner. So the foreigner will get the shirt for 400. That's it. We do not tax foreigners. Don't give me any nationalistic notions. Level playing field, fair play. Oh my God, you're charging tax to Indians and you're exempting foreigners. Yeah, that's what has to be done. Good taxation is not populistic. Okay, so good taxation is done with a clean head and it is not done with emotional considerations. You do not tax foreigners. Don't bring nationalism into this. Okay, so the foreigner comes 400, but you had accumulated input tax credits of 30. You will go to the tax authorities with that accumulated ITC, input tax credit, of 30 and get a refund of 30. So your production is fully neutral to the Indian tax system. On the high seas, the shirt is worth 400. Its price on the high seas is entirely neutral to the Indian tax system. You got all your taxes refunded. And in the global market, people are competing with each other on the price of a shirt that is immune to taxation. So one country may have a high VAT rate, one country may have a low VAT rate. At the point of sending out exports, they're all neutral because everybody is getting that zero rating of exports. So that is the brilliant trick about how you make the indirect tax system globalization compatible. Now, the shirt lands at foreign shores. Suppose you land on the border in France, and you know the French are very socialist, so they have a 20% VAT. Okay, they have a very high tax rate. They have a 20% VAT. The Indian shirt of 400 rupees will be charged the 20% VAT in France. So there, at the border, the importer will pay 80 rupees of a tax. And in France, if you had been a company producing the shirts, you would have the same 20% VAT. So you get full neutrality between domestic production and imports. And on the high seas, all countries are competing on a level playing field, which is based on zero rating of exports. And all the countries of the world are able to do this. And you've got a glorious tax system, which has solved the two critical pillars, and there is no connection with this middle pillar. But the two critical pillars of economic growth is firms should become specialized, firms should deeply engage in globalization. Both these are solved by having a correct tax policy design. You have to have this tax policy design, otherwise you are inimical to Indian economic growth. A tax system that does not do these things is harmful for Indian economic growth.
So, Ajay, that's truly edge of the seats excitement because it's such a beautiful, elegant design, right? But in practice, how can it be done wrong? How can it be done right? How should we think about it?
So once you get to one country at a time and you want to do value added tax, there are some pieces you have to get right. The first is, please keep the rate low. Don't have a value added tax of 28%. That is just nuts. What happens when you have a high rate? Then people will start trying to evade. You'll get back to a cash economy. You'll get back to all kinds of distortions because then people will change their behavior in ways that avoid that tax. So a good VAT system keeps very low rates. Okay, my preferred rate is 8%, 9%. That's all. Second is, it should be a universal value added tax. It should be on everything. Then don't have exemptions. Okay, so all the production of the economy, essentially the entire consumption base of the economy, should end up being multiplied by a low tax rate and generate a chunk of money for the government. Why is it important to have a broad tax base? The first is because all these links develop and it becomes better to create an efficient tax system that covers everybody. The second reason is that if a government wants a certain amount of money, you want to take a low tax rate and multiply by a large base. If you make the base small, then the ever thirsty government will start saying, I want a higher rate. So the path to a lower rate lies in having a comprehensive base. So then don't distinguish whether it's petrol or diesel or coal or anything. All the goods of the country should be covered in a single value added tax with a low rate. My opinion, my preferred design for India is 8%, 9%. Ideally 8%, at most 9% is a correct VAT rate for India, and that will keep evasion down, that will keep the burden of the tax down. You'll actually end up collecting something like 9% multiplied by the consumption of the entire Indian people, which will be a good chunk of money which will go to the government, and you will get the resourcing required to do peace, easy taxes, and a tolerable administration of justice. So that's the second principle, that keep the base comprehensive. And in this, we have to resist the temptation of different rates for different things. Okay, once you have different rates for different things, now you're back into politics and populism. Okay, people will start jockeying, there'll be lobbying, there'll be political economy, there'll be corruption, where somebody or the other wants a better rate for themselves. In India, we've had things like parothas being taxed at 18% and roti is being taxed at 5%, and then you'll get into classification disputes.
I mean, the classic example of this was is Kit Kat a chocolate or a biscuit? Because different rates on chocolates and biscuits.
So once you have multiple rates, you're just asking for trouble. This links to state capability. The Indian state does not have high capability. It's a very complex job to administer a VAT system with multiple rates. Some of the rates are even high. Then the incentive for evasion just goes sky high. The distortion imposed upon an economy goes up roughly in proportion to the tax rate squared. So if you're going to go from a 9% rate or an 8% rate to something like 16% or 18%, it sounds like a doubling of the rate. The economic distortions imposed actually go up by 4x. So for all these reasons, like really, what you want to do as a VAT is like 8%, 9%, single rate, like no distinguishing between different products, apply to everything. And keep your life simple. Build a simple tax administration. It is not complicated to do this kind of tax administration. In a low capability state, as in India, we'll get this done.
So, Ajay, outstanding explanation so far. Tell me about the Indian journey.
In India, we started out at an excise. An excise is a tax on production, where the excise inspector stands at the gate of a factory. And so it's a classic cascading tax. It's a bad tax. And every economist that has worked in this field for decades has been flagging this problem, that we've got to get out of that. Also, at the beginning, the excise was only a tax on goods, and services were not taxed. And services grew as a share of GDP, as inevitably happens. Then at some point, the government said, okay, let me put on a cascading tax on services. So you had a cascading tax on goods and a cascading tax on services. So that was called service tax. Okay, and this thing lasted for many, many years, and it was not good for all the reasons that I've described. It's a cascading tax. It is anti-globalization. It makes a mess between equal treatment of imports and exports. It disadvantages exports from India. Okay, so you want to solve all these problems. In 2003, Vijay Kelkar led a committee appointed by Jaswant Singh on implementation of the FRBM Act. And as part of that work, Kelkar, Arvind Modi and I just grappled with that overall fiscal problem. And we felt there was no way out for that overall fiscal problem of India without getting to the VAT, that you needed a VAT for all these reasons, that it didn't make sense solving for the FRBM, the Fiscal Responsibility and Budgetary Management Act, without getting this darkness at the heart of the Indian fiscal system out and replacing it with a clean VAT. Now, the word VAT was a bit taken because at the time there was a tax called CENVAT. A central VAT was kind of starting to happen. It was not a VAT, it did not do ITC correctly, it didn't handle services correctly, but still the word CENVAT was around. So we coined the phrase goods and services tax as a way to just distinguish, to make sure there's no confusion, that no, it's not that VAT, because otherwise we'd have to explain the 20 ways in which that was not quite a VAT. So we coined the word GST. This came out in a committee report in 2003. Unfortunately, Chidambaram, as finance minister in 2004, didn't choose to pursue this further. Partly he said we don't have the support required at many state governments. The BJP said we will not participate in any tax policy reform, and there was no ability for the Congress to overcome these barriers and get such a project through. We proposed a way in which the central government could build a integrated goods taxation and services taxation covering the union. In their world, get the VAT up and running. In the future, states can join. Chidambaram chose to not do it. He said, I'm not solving this. Okay, so the things were kicked forward till 2014. The Congress was there for 10 years. And then when Arun Jaitley became finance minister, he got back to this project. And that's how we got an announcement in 2016 and a GST in 2017. And it's been amended many times. So that's the journey of how we got here. Now, many things are off in the present Indian GST. The first is there's a large number of rates. There are rates at zero, there are very high rates, there are cesses, there are entire sectors that are exempt, like electricity is exempt, the petroleum sector is out, the real estate sector is out. So there are many, many pieces that were excluded. So the base was not comprehensive. That violates one of the principles. It's not a single rate. That violates one of the principles. And it's not a low rate. The rates were astronomically high. So all the three principles of a good VAT were violated in the GST as it unfolded, as it came out the front door. But for today, I want to talk about the most important problem of all, which is that the input tax credit has been getting increasingly blockaded. Okay, so the way I described it to you, the movement of input tax across stages of production is the heart and soul of VAT. It is the beating heart of VAT. If you don't have correct handling of input tax credit, then it's not a VAT. Then you're back to production tax. You're back to cascading taxes. Okay, there are many, many aspects in which the blockage of ITC, the blockage of input tax credit, has started happening. So there are rules which say that if you are a goods company and you are a final stage producer of goods, then input tax credit will not be given correctly for services and for capital goods. If you're a services company, input tax credit will not be given correctly. There are many things which are at 5% GST, which would make you excited. Wow, 5% is a low rate. But then the taxman giveth and the taxman taketh away. So alongside the transition to a 5% rate, in many cases, input tax credit has been blocked. So in fact, you're now paying a very high tax rate, the combination of 5% on the last stage of production and all the upstream taxes which are not being refunded. Okay, so there is a variety of these kinds of problems that have crept into the Indian tax system. And when you look at the full range of the problems that have arisen, it really starts making you gloomy that in many respects, we actually don't have a VAT anymore. We are back to an old style taxation of production, something like an old excise regime, an old service tax regime. It just feels like we've lost the idea. We've lost the essence of the value added tax in a significant footprint of the Indian economy. We don't have numerical estimates of how big that footprint is, but it's quite a bit. So there are several legal institutional mechanisms through which either the input tax credit is blocked altogether or it is slowed down, which is cost of capital. So if the ITC does not happen instantaneously and it imposes a working capital cost on you, it is a tax. So that working capital cost, the interest you pay on the working capital because the government is giving that money back to you late, is a tax. So there's no way to get around this problem that there has been a significant amount of ITC blockage in the present Indian GST system. And this is a first order failure. Like whatever else you might choose to do with the GST, we must run, not walk. And first, just get seamless end-to-end input tax credit. That is value-added tax. Otherwise, we're suffering a much bigger harm. Remember all the things I said about cascading taxes, how bad cascading taxes are, that the effective rate of taxation can become very high for long chains of production. It creates incentives for vertical integration, which goes against specialization and it's harmful for economic growth. And again, depending on the situation, it creates a mess with importers and exporters. It interferes with the integration of firms with globalization. It damages 2 out of the 3 pathways through which the firms in India can give us GDP growth. So this is first order. You really need to fix this.
So, when the seen and the unseen started in the early days, episodes would not be these long deep dives, but they would just be looking at one policy at a time. I had early episodes on demonetization and many episodes on GST. And the way I thought about them was demonetization was just a disastrous policy measure, conceptually wrong, everything was bad about it. But GST was conceptually great, but the implementation was terrible. In fact, the first of my episodes on the GST was with our friend Devanshu Datta, and Devanshu correctly predicted everything that is going to go wrong with it. This was before the GST was actually announced. And then later I had a comprehensive episode with Shruti Rajgopalan as well. But what you just said a while back, worries me deeply, because it seems that even in terms of being true to the conceptual basis of the GST, that, the input tax credit has to work properly. Otherwise, what is the point even? So I was not aware that that is blockaded in so many different ways. So give me a deeper look at what is going wrong and what the consequences of that can be.
Yeah. So what is going wrong is too many people working in tax policy have not prized this concept of the VAT. It's a very economisty notion. You've got to be an economist to treasure the specialization of firms and the globalization of the economy. And this clarity, the beauty of value added tax as ITC flowing correctly at every stage of production. So many decisions have been made. If you are a goods selling company, we will block input tax credit associated with services, associated with capital goods. If you are a services trading company, we will block input tax credit. If you are a 5% GST, oh, we've done such a favor, we've given 5% GST, so we'll block input tax credit. Okay, things like that. So there's just a lack of conceptual coherence, the lack of that intellectual framework of what is the GST. So policy making is being done by practical people. These are good people. We wish them well. They mean well in what they're doing, but I feel that there is a philosophy and a paradigm that is also required and that needs to be brought to the table when working on these kinds of questions. And the consequences are all the things that you can think of. If you are a small company, then you will have a working capital problem, because there are many elements of the story where there's blockage of money and it drives up your working capital requirement. If you face competition from imports, then actually you're on awkward territory, because at the point of imports, there's a GST on imports. But for domestic production, there's a cascading tax. So you may think that there is neutrality because imports are being charged GST on imports, but there is not neutrality, because imports are being charged just the GST on imports. The footprint of the Indian state has not applied on all the upstream stages of production. But in India, there is a cascading tax with the effective rate which is much higher than the apparent GST rate on the final output. This is a terrible state of affairs. It's negative protection for Indian producers or exporters. Okay, there can be blockages of input tax credit, and then the exporting company does not get the zero rating. Now the Indian exporter is at a disadvantage, because everywhere in the world there are brilliant Bengali economists who have done the VAT correctly in Bangladesh. Okay, so all these kinds of effects, and then think of how it plays on the firms. The firms will become less specialized, the firms will become less globalized. You'll get more clamor by Indian firms saying, look, we'll never be able to compete with a Brazilian firm, with a South Korean firm, just give us tariffs. Okay, and then the Indian economy will get worse and worse. We will get deglobalized. This entire journey to economic growth requires to be grounded on principles, on theory, on philosophy of how to do a tax system correctly.
And at some level, there seems to be a mindset problem here. Like right at the start of the episode, we spoke about, 15 rupees out of 100 GDP, 15 rupees out of 200 GDP. And the mindset issue that I have with so many of my fellow citizens is that we assume that the state is there to rule us and not to serve us. And actually, we should think that the state is there to serve us. The people are paramount. And what is happening here is, it seems to me that at some point in time, the basic conceptual reason behind the GST existing has completely gone out of the window, and it is just another system of taxation. And now you have a state which is sitting and administering the system of taxation in his usual heavy-handed bureaucratic way, where you are assumed guilty until proven innocent, where your input tax credit will be blocked unless you can show why it should not be blocked. And again, the state is a MyBap and it is running everything, and then it becomes a state capability issue in the context of mindset. Is that a correct summation?
Yeah, there are meetings where a decision is being made that we'll block the input tax credit for this so that we'll get a little more money. And there is nobody in that room standing there to say, but, what about GDP? That when you have a cascading tax, it is going to harm the GDP. But the way these decisions are made, they're dominated by tax administrators who are charged with raising more money for the Indian government. And so instead of 15 on 100, they think they're getting to 16 on 100. And they're not keeping track of the fact that they've actually hampered the pathway from a GDP of 100 to a GDP of 200. The ultimate game, every single policy decision should be judged in terms of what it does to the prospect of high Indian economic growth. But the practitioners, the tax administrators who in India now call the shots on tax policy are not thinking in a more economisty way. In all advanced countries, there is a very interesting separation that tax policy is done by the economists. It's not done by the tax administrators. So to use Indian jargon, the design of tax policy should happen at the Department of Economic Affairs in the Ministry of Finance, which should be dominated by economists. And then the Department of Revenue gets that document, they get the finance bill. The law is written at the DEA, and that should go to the Department of Revenue, who would then have to administer it. But the way things have gone in India, over the years, the power in tax policy has moved from DEA to DOR. And then you've got a bunch of very practical people doing tax policy. And then out of that, a lot of these kinds of rigidities have come in. And I just think that a lot more thinking and principles will go a long way, that it will really help if we are able to bring these intellectual perspectives into the fray. And this also goes to our theory of change. Okay, the EIE episode, The Long Road to Change. The way we've always talked about it is that the most important change that happens in the country is upstream of policymakers. It is in the ideas, it is in the knowledge, it is in the people, it is in papers, it is in books, it is in documents, it is in blog articles. And you know what? It is in certain remarkable YouTube channels. Okay? When all that happens, then you've comprehensively changed the climate of opinion. And then, yeah, there will be practical people who will man seats in government and they will reflect that knowledge of the country, and then they will translate that into practical policy decisions. But if that overall ecosystem of ideas and knowledge and people and documents and papers and seminars and conferences and intellectual leadership is lacking, then it is difficult to be a civil servant. Okay, you and I have many good friends who are civil servants. When you occupy that chair, it's very difficult to have that strategic sense. People are firefighting, they're dealing with problems, and they are inevitably trying to think in a practical way. And they work with consulting firms. They will talk to a Price Waterhouse, and a Price Waterhouse is not going to give them economic principles. A Price Waterhouse is going to be a consultant saying, you want to get X done, we'll get X done, we'll implement it for you. They are very pleased. They'll say, we got government engagement. So there is nobody in the present arrangement who is actually thinking for principles, for knowledge, for the processes that happen upstream of the policymaker. And actually all the progress in India only happens upstream of the policymaker.
Politics is downstream of culture, policy is downstream of culture also. So, Ajay, this is quite a masterclass, edge of the seat indeed, and thankfully I haven't fallen off my chair yet. But, tell me more about the fix. What can be done? Sum it up for me.
So first, we need to use the legal analysis that I just mentioned, which has documented an array of ways in which any and every blockage of input tax credit has crept into the Indian GST. And we need to run, not walk, and remove it. Because that is stage one. That input tax credit is the beating heart of the value added tax. And any interference with that takes us back to cascading taxes, to taxation of production, all the infirmities of the pre-GST age. Second, we need to get to a low single rate. Okay, it is nuts to have multiple rates, to have classification disputes, to have this roti paratha conversation. And you really need a single rate, you need a low rate, and you need a comprehensive base. We need to bring all the sectors of the economy into the GST. So the answer is exactly where we were in 2003. have a single rate, have a low rate, with a comprehensive base, and I'm embarrassed to say, with no blockages against input tax credit.
It is a long game. It is a hard fight, isn't it, Ajay?